Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I think this is number 22. I think we're all the way up to number 22. So started earlier this year in January, and both of these gentlemen were kind enough to be with me for the very first podcast, and they've both been honored guests here at the podcast, been back on numerous occasions, and I'm certain, I can only imagine, I hope they'll come back again, and we'll talk more about anything in any way, shape, or form related to Ed Wood. One thing that happened a couple of podcasts ago, I talked to Paul Apel about a short story, and we opined whether we thought it was written by Ed Wood or not. And he suggested at the end of it, hey, it might be kind of cool, Greg, if you take books that are reputed to be Ed Wood work and sort of debunk them, which I started doing way the heck back in 2015 on the Ed Wood Wednesdays blog, Joe Blevins' Ed Wood Wednesdays portion of his Dead Rights blog, and kind of got away from that over time. Then started to think almost antithetical to that, being more inclusive, wanting to find more actual Ed Wood rather than debunk stuff that may or may not be Ed Wood. Curiously enough, shortly after Paul mentioned this to me, James Pontolillo, author of the superb Unknown War of Edward D. Wood Jr., also worth mentioning that Joe Blevins is co-author of Dad Made Dirty Movies, the book, a great book about Stephen Apostolof, co-written with Jordon Todorov. So stealing your thunder, you guys probably want to talk about that yourselves. But in any case, Jim brought this book to Joe and I, and it had long been rumored to potentially be a book written by Ed Wood. And he said, what do you guys think? And hence, we're here today to tell you what we think. So we haven't really discussed this at any great length. So I'm curious to see what we ultimately think. I think we know each other's conclusions to a degree, but how we got there should be a fun conversation for us. And we hope it's a fun conversation for you, obviously. So we're going to talk about a book called Mask of Evil. I'm going to give it over to Jim here momentarily to sort of give us the background on that, since he brought this project to the table. I do want to say we've obtained a new sponsor here at the Summit Podcast, and it's 30th Street Graphics, 30sg.com. Go over there. They phenomenal collection of mostly fetish and fetish related magazines. They do have some adult paperbacks, but scans of a lot of fetish related magazines, including some wonderful work by all the heavyweight artists within the space. You know, Eric Stanton, Gene Bilbrew, Bill Ward, Robert Bishop, magazines galore for everything. We've talked, Jim and I talked once, we talked quite a bit about Eros Goldstripe and female mimics. You can find plenty of Eros Goldstripe titles over there. And Ed did, in fact, we know, write for Eros Goldstripe. Joe and I broke down an unknown Ed Wood book published by Eros Goldstripe, as a matter of fact, a month or so ago, Saving Grace, aka as published by Eros Goldstripe, Sex Salvation. So there's lots of great material, nearly 1,000 titles at the 30th Street Graphics site. You can get them anywhere in the range from about $3 to $6 a piece. Luckily enough, the proprietor happens to be a buddy of mine, so he extended to me and allowed me to extend to you as a viewer of the podcast, a BOGO. So buy one, get one. So go over to the site. If you find an item that you want, click the contact button and just mention Greg or mention the Ed Wood Summit podcast. He'll get back to you and he'll set you up for getting an item and one of equal or lesser value for nothing. So that was very gracious of him. It's a one-time offer, just so you can sample the site if you haven't been there. But if you do, if you know the site and you have ordered there previously, you know what I'm talking about. Just a treasure trove of absolutely astounding material. Really, Betty Page, Irving Klaw. I could go on and on. Especially the Bilbrew and Stanton stuff. Very expensive, pricey stuff. If you were to try to buy physical copies, you would have to be an affluent person to actually put together a collection of Eric Stanton work. But 30th Street Graphics has done all that work for you. Really beautiful scans, and the product descriptions written by the gentleman who runs the site are quite astute and extraordinarily well written. And so I think you'll have fun just even surfing the site. But definitely, if you are so inclined, order something over at 30th Street Graphics and tell them that the Summit Podcast sent you, as always. So let's do a quick, before we jump into Mask of Evil, let's Joe, you want to introduce yourself real quick? Then I'll give it over to Jim for an intro, and Jim can segue us right into Mask of Evil.
Hi, I'm Joe Blevins. I'm the blogger behind Dead to Rights, where you'll find Ed Wood Wednesdays. It's a long-running series about Ed Wood and every facet of woodology, which is a term I think I coined. And I'm just excited to be here today to talk about this incredibly weird novel that that Jim found for us. So
Cool.
looking forward to talking to it. And also, if I'm plugging stuff, I got a Happy Days podcast. These Days Are Ours. Find it at thesedaysareours.libsyn.com. And we're up to season 7. So we've reviewed 7 seasons of Happy Days. Go there and find out more than you ever needed to know about this classic American sitcom.
For sure. Heroic effort, Joe, on the Happy Days podcast. Kudos on that. So Jim, you want to give us an intro and then tell us a little bit about what we're here to today to discuss and how you decided to bring this one to light.
I'm going to first start off with what they call in the biz log rolling by recommending people go to the Happy Days podcast. I am a cynical person with no interest in Happy Days who just went there because I know Joe, and it was shocked to find, wow, this is a really interesting dissection of each episode. I watched Happy Days growing up. It was not something I would have ever considered revisiting. And you guys really bring the show to life, and you've got all sorts of interesting and witty commentary to make. And it's I was shocked because I thought I went to listen to 1 or 2 episodes because of some particular content that you had told me about in them, but have stayed to listen to quite a few more just because it's a really, really well put together podcast.
Thank you.
I can't
Jim.
recommend it highly enough, even if you don't think you might have a particular interest in the topic.
Well, I always say that I treat Happy Days the way I treat Ed Wood, which is it's just a prism through which to look at the world. It's a lens through which you can look at the world. It's it's just you can talk about all kinds of subjects, and you use Happy Days as the focus point to jump off and talk about all kinds of other stuff, which is what I always do on this podcast about Ed Wood. We started talking about Ed Wood, and I'm off on 10 other topics usually by the end of it.
So anyway, I'm Jim Pontolillo. As Greg said, I've authored The Unknown War of Ed Wood Jr. about his military service in World War II. And I've just been a Woodophile, and if we can actually call ourselves researchers, a Wood researcher for some years now. In recent discussions, this book has been lurking. This is unfortunately a sort of a poor copy of it. Some poor soul who didn't know that by taking a pen and ink to this, they would be reducing its value substantially. We have Mask of Evil, 1966, by Charlene White, the First Nighter book series out of Buffalo, New York. Don't swear by it, but off the top of my head, I'm going to say I think this first sort of came into the realm of Ed Wood books because of the Cornell University site, whoever pulled that together. I think that's the first site that listed this as a putative Ed Wood book. I don't recall seeing previous claims. And I've never really seen, I got my copy well over a decade ago. I can't really remember how long ago now. At that point in time, I had never really seen any evidence offered by anyone. It was just one of these books that appeared on a list that someone had pulled together. And there really wasn't any rationale given as to why this book printed on the East Coast should be considered by Ed. So a while back, I lucked out in getting a copy and read it back then and immediately set it aside, feeling that I have no idea why they thought this was by Ed. It doesn't, I didn't do any sort of an in-depth analysis of it. It was more of just a gut feeling from having read a lot of Ed at that point, his novels, that it just did not feel at all like his style or content. So I've set the book aside for many years, and it recently came up in discussions again, like Greg said. And I thought, well, would be a good time to pull it out, reread it with a completely fresh mind and at least 10 more years of experience in seeing Wood's texts, and just see, does it strike me any differently this time? At the same time, I also imaged it because there are no digital copies available anywhere that I'm aware of. And I sent the images to Greg and Joe to also, get them to weigh in on it.
Cool. For sure. And
Yeah.
so I thought about this the other day. I thought, when's the last time anybody read Mask of Evil? All three of us have read it here recently. It's the most this book has perhaps ever been read in a short period of time since it's been published. It's interesting. A couple of quick comments. The cover on the one you have has a certain color scheme. There's actually an alternative cover for Mask of Evil with the same exact drawing, but it has different color palette. And actually, it was the gentleman who runs the 30th Street Graphics site who mentioned to me that Eric Stanton was in fact colorblind. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating, and it made me think, could he have colored a couple of different versions of it for whatever reason? There aren't multiple color schemes that work in the rest of the First Snyder series, which there's upwards of, oh my God, Jim, how many is there? You sent us all the cover. Jim went on a heroic quest recently and found covers for all of them.
The First Snyder series is about 40 or 50 books.
40,
and then,
Yeah.
And then the other imprints they have about that many also. Yeah, the alternate color scheme is actually, the background color is actually very close to this vampiric looking guy's cloak,
right.
So that everybody, it all seems to fade into the backdrop much more.
Right.
That cover and that title really set me up for a completely different kind of book than what this is. I was like, when do the vampires show up in this thing? When does she go to Transylvania? None of that happens. This all happens on like Long Island.
This is the sizzle selling you the crappy steak that's unrelated to the sizzle.
But they were selling you like a completely different thing. It's like selling you like, the sizzle, but then they sell you like a shrimp salad or something. It's like whatever they have is not related to what's on the cover at all. And that title is a real stretch. I mean, there are masks, I guess, and I don't know. Evil would be a stretch for what's described here. It's really not at all what they promise on the title, on the cover. So if you're out there and you find a copy of this book and you buy it based on the cover and the title, you're going to be disappointed once you go in, because the contents of the book have very little to do with what you think you're going to get. Now, Ed Wood would write things, he wrote those magazines that are just full of scary, sexy stories, where you have Frankenstein monsters and things on the covers. And Ed will go to that place. Ed will give you some real horror sex stuff if that's really what you want. If you want spooky sex stuff, Ed wrote that. There's tons of that stuff. So I'm not sure why they sold this particular novel in that way. Why would they try to sell it sort of as a Halloween or monster themed novel when it's not that at all?
Well, I mean, if they had a cover that actually followed the plot at all, it would have to have been a painting of like a garden party on someone's estate with people standing around holding drinks, or I mean,
right.
It's about this woman who moves in this world of the wealthy on her quest to find this guy from the past. And
if I were to give a very, very brief summary of what this is, like a pitch for what this book is to people, I would say it's sort of like Eyes Wide Shut with a head injury. It's basically like an enfeebled, lobotomized Eyes Wide Shut. So it's rich people having like kinky mask parties, which is a little bit hinted at in The Shining as well, where, like that this hotel was home to all these rich people and they were getting into some weird stuff, and maybe some of them were wearing masks occasionally. Like if you can picture those parties at the Overlook Hotel, or if you know about like the masked sex parties in Eyes Wide Shut, that will kind of set you up for what this is about. I will ask this question. Are either of you or both of you familiar with the Hammer movie Brides of Dracula?
Sure, that's
Oh, yeah.
actually one of my very favorite. That's my favorite Terrence Fisher movie.
I love that movie, and I
Mm,
could not help but think about Brides of Dracula during the opening passages of this book, because you have this naive French lady,
Mhm.
this rich guy, and his mom. It's basically a big house where the rich guy and his mom live. And then the naive French lady comes in and she's like, oh, what is this? Oh, oh, sacre bleu, mon Dieu, what is this? All this thing happening. And I was like, oh, this is a lot like Brides of Dracula. The horny old lady in this book is a little bit like the mom in Brides of Dracula. What it's missing, of course, is the servant character in Brides of Dracula. And also Brides of Dracula is a great story, and this thing is a mess. So, but I don't want to make the comparison too much. I couldn't help but think of Brides of Dracula during the early passages, especially because I was still holding out hope at this point that this was a vampire novel or a monster novel or a horror novel in some way, which it isn't.
maybe you found the connection, Joe, right to the cover. Perhaps, right? The vampire brides on their knees on the cover. So I didn't think of that, by the way, that connection. That's a great point. So real quick, going back to the cover, that's an Eric Stanton cover. I think we might have mentioned that, but I punched this one in on Bookfinder last night for the hell of it. And I thought, is there any copies floating around right now? And I found one floating around out there at current for $250. It did say Stanton cover, which is again what's fetching that going price, but it did also say rumored to be written by Ed Wood, so that old saw still continues to be peddled by booksellers.
This is an object lesson to watch eBay like a hawk, because when I went in recently, I saw that back in September somebody snagged an absolutely mint condition copy of this for $75. Nobody bid against them.
Nice.
So even these well-known and collectible things can slip under the radar.
For sure.
And you can get them for a more reasonable price.
For sure. We're going to talk a little bit more. We get a little deeper into it. We'll talk a little bit more about First Nighter and a few of other First Nighter titles. Jim has done some additional research trying to connect the dots. Did we mention it? Charlene White is the credited author here.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
So Charlene White, and is that Ed Wood, I guess, is the operative question. So you guys both mentioned a little bit of the plot element, but yeah. So Brigitte Lamercy is a war orphan, and a woman named Maddie becomes her foster mother and raises her. And Maddie is looking for the man she knew in the war, the GI named Randy, who she had this torrid affair with, and it's the love of her life. And they lost touch at the end of the war. And so now that Bridget is grown, she decides to I don't know what made her think, I'm gonna find Randy if I go and I hang out with rich people on Long Island Sound. Right? She
came with no plan.
Right.
She had no idea. And Randy's last name does not stay the same from one paragraph to another. He's sometimes Randy Ransom and sometimes Randy Manson. So I don't know how she expects to find him if his last name keeps changing. We have to point out right at the start here, this is the worst edited novel I have ever seen in my life. It looks like it was typed with boxing gloves on their hands or something. They make up numbers for the chapters.
Oh, wow.
There are numbers that don't exist in the English language. Chapter 13.
13, yep, chapter 13. So what Joe's referring to, it's literally spelled that way, right?
And it's not chapter 8, it's chapter A.
Chapter A with no T on it, EIGH, chapter A. Right?
So
and there's text clearly missing in a few spots,
right?
Where like 3 sentences somehow got left out.
Yeah.
And some repeats and then
okay.
And then deep into the book, there's that one point where seemingly the author lost track of the plot line, and 2 chapters later, it's like the videotape has been reversed and it plays forward again, ignoring events that already occurred.
I thought I was losing my mind because I was like, didn't I read this part already? Are we going like? So this book was, I was going to say it wasn't double checked, but it wasn't even single checked. Nobody looked at this thing before it
Right.
went out.
No.
And I have to imagine it was written very, very quickly. I mean, this is what you write if somebody has literally a gun pointed to your head and said, write an erotic novel now. And you're like, "Ugh," you're typing as fast as you possibly can to write it. So this book is not easy to follow. I will say I had to stop a few times and eventually I started writing down all the characters and, because
Yep.
this novel keeps chucking characters at you every few pages, like every 3 pages, because Brigitte, I always called her Maddie because Madeline was
Right.
probably short for Madeline. But they keep chucking new characters at you like every 3 pages. Like there's a polo player and then there's another polo player. What we needed 2 polo players in this thing. And it's because they want to keep giving Brigitte new people to have sex with,
Pretty much, right?
every few pages. And sometimes they'll just disappear from the book. They introduce like this character, Alicia, who is the latest, she's the latest wife of Brigitte's employer. Oh, but the other book that this reminded me of was, are you familiar with the book, The Other Side of Midnight?
Mhm.
The Other Side of Midnight, I think it was by Sidney Sheldon. Or
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
okay,
Right.
so that is about this woman who wants, after the war, after World War II, to reconnect with her ex-GI lover from America. She's like, so she's trying to find her wartime boyfriend again. And that's a little bit what this novel is about. This was way before, I think this was before The Other Side of Midnight came out.
Right.
So this is just a coincidence, but that also brings up the time frame of this book, because this is supposed to be about 15 years after World War II. So that would put it 1960. So I'm guessing that's when, and this is supposed to be set. But as you pointed out, Brigitte, who kind of remains the French innocent, and they write some of her dialogue in this sort of phonetic cartoon French,
Mhm.
What are you talking about? We see. So they
It's
talk.
the words that begin with the H's, Joe. That's always a apostrophe, and then so it's im. It happens. It happens.
What happens?
Right? Yeah.
But with, I think, becomes wheeze. What are you?
Yeah.
What are you doing? We set. But the other thing that I thought about Brigitte is seeming like she has so many sex partners, but she kind of remains the innocent lamb through
Yeah.
this whole thing. She becomes, so there's a little bit of like a story of, kind of, sexual initiation thing going through the whole book. But like, it seemed like every sexual encounter, this was her grand awakening. Like she had never known passion before like this. She finally felt like a real woman. And then like, 3 pages later, this was finally the great passion. This was her first great love. And it's like, and then 5 pages later, she had never known love like this before. She had, it's like, how many sexual awakenings can one person have? You can only have one. Like, you can't have one every like 3 pages. She can't be like, she can't have her eyes opened sexually, like by every single person she meets.
I think she had the first one with the old guy,
Yes,
and then she had a new one with a young guy who had better equipage, and then she had one with a woman.
Mhm.
and
So there's at least 3 I can recall.
but I don't. It seemed like they went to that. Well, she has more. I think she has more partners than that, because I think like
yeah.
the old guy's mom, I think,
Yeah.
and the old guy's new wife, Alicia.
That was the pain-induced one with the old guy's mom.
The paddling stuff.
That happens on a couple of occasions where
Oh, good Lord.
Brigitte shows a real propensity to immediately start whipping or beating her lovers, and it's not seemingly born of any sort of S&M bent. It's usually born of her frustration that she's not able to get off to the extent that she wants to. It's when she's frustrated with their performance. And they, of course, at first, as their bodies begin to wheel and welt and things like that, as it's described, they, of course, immediately bend the corner and immediately start to like the way that Brigitte treats them in just about every case. But yeah, there's so many people, old people, young people, you name it. She continues having sex with well, I don't want to say that until we get gave it something away.
So one thing I'll just pop in and say is, when After Hours and First Nighter and those books were coming out from 63 through 68, at that time they were at the cutting edge of introducing fetish and other things to the paperback market. So, getting to what you were saying about the sort of the preponderance of bondage and discipline and things, Joe, this was a definite market choice by I'll assume it was the owner who was telling the writers, what sort of content he wanted in the books that they were writing on spec for him. That, he did not want, vanilla sex between aesthetically appealing individuals necessarily. He wanted stuff out there on the edges, and we can talk about this a little later, but certainly in some of the other books that I've read from that series, it's actually they're much more rugged than Mask of Evil with that content.
I got enough for Mask of Evil. I don't want to see like old ladies being paddled and stuff like that. And they said Cornelia was a student of the Marquis de Sade and all this. And so Cornelia was, they also describe her as a dowager. So that was, that's not a term that greatly arouses me. Dowager is not, a term of great eroticism for me, but I don't know.
I got to use that quote in a book sometime. I don't want to see old ladies getting paddled. Joe Blevins.
Well, and then there's this, what they think kinky sex content is bizarre. Moves on from Cornelia to a new employer, John Hammond. Yeah. And then John is basically the one whose parties, I believe, give this book its title. I think the title is based on what happens at John's parties, and that was the Eyes Wide Shut. He basically is holding it like Eyes Wide Shut kind of parties, but his are themed in a way that I thought was just asinine. He has like what was it? The girls are dressed as flowers, and the waiters, he keeps calling them waiters, are dressed as trees. And I was like, trees don't have sex with flowers. And a guy wearing a tree costume, that's not sexy. What are you talking about, man? This is,
I guess we could project some really bargain basement Freud here with those big rigid trees and the soft yielding flower buds.
Very nice. Good point.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going down a.
I mean, it makes sense. Yeah.
The eroticism of flowers is a theme from like if you see the photos of Robert Mapplethorpe's photos of flowers, you see the eroticism in flowers. And I guess there have been erotic pictures taken of trees because if you've ever seen a John Waters film, A Dirty Shame, he talks about how in that movie, the characters talk about how trees look dirty, especially if you look at them upside down, it looks like, because they look like crotches,
I had an uncle who had a vast collection. He was a photographer, and he had a vast collection of tree erotica that he took.
Well, see, now John Waters got really into the modern art scene, and he put out like a coffee table book of his favorite modern artists and what they were doing. And one was like a dirty tree photo. And he says, oh, and so now I see, oh, that's where he got the idea for the scene in A Dirty Shame, where the ladies are looking at trees and they're getting sexually aroused, is because that was something that's happening in the art world. And now every time I go to the park, and I look at the trees, I think, well, thanks for that imagery. So, but if you look at trees, yeah, I guess they are, but a guy in a tree costume. And why he's calling them waiters? I guess they're waiters. I don't are they serving
Coming around
drinks
with the drinks and the canapes, I assume.
in the tree costumes?
Yeah, the waiters in the tree. What I took it to be, Joe, was that there are actually no males at the party. The only males allowed at the party are the actual servants, right?
Yeah,
so they're there to be sexual servants as well.
Yes,
clearly.
I, I got that.
Except
so
for John
And
Hammond.
you're just thinking of how difficult it would be to be, shackled in this big tree trunk with probably your arms sticking out holding trays.
And it wouldn't be sexy to me, but we should point out that her second employer, John, has a sex party for just the women.
Mhm.
And then he has one for the men. He has he has the rite of Aphrodite, and then he has the rite of Eros. So he has a girl sex party, and then a boy sex party. And this book also has the strangest way of staying faithful to a woman that I've ever heard described in any book. When these two lovers have been kept apart, the guy does stay faithful because he does not have sex with any women while they are apart. He chooses a very different path for his version of fidelity or celibacy. That I don't know.
The rights of Alcatraz.
Yes. So that's the path he chooses. And I guess we're supposed to be fine with that by the end of the book, because we're supposed to be fine with the way Randy decided to stay faithful. But the closest that this book actually comes to being saying evil, to being evil, the way the title says evil, is that sometimes Brigitte, who again is this, despite all of her sexual experiences, this wide-eyed innocent lamb, she's like swimming with the sharks here in Long Island because, she's just got all these perverts all around her doing all this kind of weird stuff. And she's like, oh, what is this? Oh, sacre bleu, what is this? She's like continually surprised by all this. And there are a few times when she feels like it's so kinky what's happening all around her that she feels lost. Like, how did I wind up in this situation? How am I here? What am I going to do? But she usually gets over it within like a page or two.
Yes.
Well, that's part of, there's a dynamic throughout this book of people being sexually assaulted and then being grateful they've been sexually assaulted.
Well,
or certainly appreciating it.
That's
in large measure.
Right.
That's a weirdly common theme, both in sex films and in sex books of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Is the people who are, as you say, assaulted and then they end up enjoying it. I think Brigitte is probably the kind of the ultimate example. She just, all kinds of stuff is done to her, and she ultimately, I guess, is grateful for it. Although by the end, she seems to be back on a path toward just heteronormative, celibacy or monogamy. She seems to be like living a clean life. I just reread I'm thinking of this because I just reread the biography of Russ Meyer, and his big studio film was Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. And that film has all kinds of craziness in it, but it ends with a triple wedding. And so like, oh, okay, I guess after all this craziness and sex has gone on, okay, the three surviving characters are all getting married, so I guess we're back on the path of, we're back on the straight and narrow in the last 5 minutes of the movie.
To a degree, right? I mean, well, in the movie, right? In the book,
movie,
it's a little different, yeah.
So in this, it at least looks like, you know, Brigitte is settling down with one of the polo players, although she also had sex with another polo player. And it looks like, you know, the thing that I guess that I think I would have been frustrated by if I had bought this book is that this whole book is predicated on the Randy Maddie relationship. And they never have a scene together they don't have 5 seconds together in this book.
Maddie never shows up. Maddie is not a character in the book. She's just a remembrance by others. And yeah, it's elided at the end. It's completely elided. It's more important to mention Tommy is going to be with Bridget and or Brigitte, and I'm saying she had yeah. So I don't know how sort of heterosexually normal her life is going to become, because not long before, did I pick up something that I missed, guys, where she early on when she figures out this is really Randy, right? This is really him. And then everything looks like it's all going to come together, and Tommy and her are going to get married. And then a few chapters later, Tommy proposes to her. In the interim, of course, she has sex with Andrew when she happens to, you know, be in the city. Even that. And then she invites the chauffeur, Harper, to go down on her right after they have sex for not sure why, apropos of nothing.
I think Andrew and Harper were the characters that broke me, because like we're well into the book at this point and we have tons of characters already in this thing. And then suddenly we have to care about this. Suddenly, like Brigitte out of freaking nowhere is going to the YMCA all the time for get-togethers. Like, where did that come from? We were in high society. We were having like these kinky sex parties at mansions, and it was like, again, it was like Eyes Wide Shut for morons.
YMCA.
And then all of a sudden, yeah, she goes to the YMCA. Go ahead.
Well, Hammond told her, you know, you can bring somebody to the right, anybody you want to bring to the next ritual. Because he was feeling that she was a little downtrodden, and Hammond does seem to have some kind of strange soft spot for her, where he is kind of like, "I'll go into the city and take a little time off, or bring somebody back to the." I don't know what made her think, I'm going to go to the YMCA to find the gentleman who I'm going to sort of convince to come back to the next ritual with me. It's called a number of things, right? The Rite of Aphrodite, the mass of Eros at one point.
I took the Rite of Aphrodite to be for the girls, and then the Rite of Eros to be for the boys, because like this, because they have sort of a symbolic virgin sacrifice at these parties. And so I thought the one with the girls, I always thought of that as the Rite of Aphrodite, and then the one at the boys with the boys was the Rite of Eros. And of course, Andrew, I think is deflowered. I think they even use that word.
Yes. Yeah, right.
At the Rite of Eros.
Shouldn't he have been debarked since Men of Trees? I mean, anyway, sorry.
By Randy.
But it's by Randy. Right. And it was like, but it's okay because he's just having gay sex. He's not being unfaithful to Maddie. He's just, you know.
Right.
The other thing that I thought
it has nothing to do with commitment or loving feelings. It's just a physical act of release and relief, I guess. Right. Here's the rationale.
And then whose mom had to be fixed up at the end so she could be out of the way? Was it Randy's mom?
Yeah, we've got to get her out of the way so Randy can.
We have another horny old lady in this book. Jeez Louise, what was this written for the Golden Girls going on here? What is?
Of course, she chooses Harper.
Well,
she chooses
Harper.
well, that's where we got the dueling endings going on there, where the author lost the track of what he had written.
Okay. I guess in a way I was thinking a little bit of the movie Young Lady Chatterley, because that one, all the servants have to get matched up with somebody, and I think there's even the chauffeur is an older guy in that. I think even he gets to have some sex in that film. So that's what it reminded me of a little bit, but. No, I don't.
we've talked a little bit about different plot elements that are going to be leaving you guys scratching your heads, and the likelihood of you actually reading this book is probably fairly slim. So real quick, I want to go back to what Jim was just saying a minute ago, because this is fascinating. But yeah, the writer, could this be Ed Wood? We're going to opine on that obviously shortly. I think you guys already know where our heads are at. But the writer at one point, so what's happening at this point is Brigitte has found Randy, and Randy's mother will not move to France to be with Maddie. She will not allow her son to be with somebody. She's a widower, and she wants to stay in the house that she lived in with her husband, and that's it. So Brigitte initially has this scheme: what if I can find a mate for Randy's mom? Then I could free him up. So it happens in the first time it's mentioned. Very, very quickly it transpires where on a cruise, she's on a cruise, and she meets an old gentleman, and they hit it off, and they get together, and now Randy is free to pursue his relationship with Maddie. And then I think it's like chapter 15 or something, it starts all over again as if that never happened. And now the story becomes even more confusing, because you think, who was the guy on the cruise ship? Because the cruise ship is mentioned again.
Because that's when I started feeling like I was losing my mind. I was feeling like, wait, wasn't this all resolved like a few pages ago or a couple of chapters ago?
Indeed it was.
Yep.
I would suspect that whoever wrote this wrote to a point and put it down, and then when he came back to finish it up, forgot how far he advanced the plot and just continued on where he thought he had left off without actually looking, and just started writing again, slightly ahead of where he had actually previously gotten. So
inebriated, perhaps.
I mean,
possibly.
How else would you explain that?
So we should explain the way that Greg and I read this was through the images that you sent, and you just literally like took pictures of, you just opened the book and took pictures of the whole thing. So, and then you sent us that in a few different chunks, so right, more manageable pieces. And so I thought I had
misplaced,
lost my place. I thought I was wrong. So I was like, wait, did I get that? So I went back. So there was parts of this book that I had to read through 2 or 3 times. Well, Greg, you were saying
Sorry,
like,
Joe.
this would, we haven't, you'd be confused if you were trying to follow the book. I'm confused trying to follow the book because it's basically a series of adventures for Brigitte. She comes to America to look for her foster mother's long lost boyfriend. She just goes from sort of one sexual encounter to another, meeting strange people along the way and going to a lot of weird sex parties. And then everything sort of resolves itself at the end. A lot of this, I think, could have been cannibalized to make like little short stories that they could have just sold to the magazines along the way, because a lot of these are sort of self-contained little sexual vignettes or adventures that she goes on. And I guess if you sew them all together, it makes a novel. Now, I've been reading a lot of Ed Wood lately, and one of the books that he wrote was something called It Takes One to Know One, which is a sort of a road novel where this guy goes on basically a long quest, and it has different parts to it. Like there's a part where he's kind of hoboing around the country with this other lady, and then he hooks up with his like an uncle who's a con artist, and then that's part of the book. And then there's part where he's up in like a mountain town, but at least you could follow this one character through all these different adventures. And it was I had to wonder if Ed kind of sewed together like a few different unfinished books or a few different short stories were sort of sewn together into like this long and winding gerrymandered kind of novel. But that was more comprehensible than Mask of Evil. Mask of Evil is almost unfollowable. For me, it was almost unfollowable because it's so confusingly written. And part of that is that the characters' names do not stay consistent. They'll spell them differently, sometimes within a paragraph or a sentence. Cordelia, I think, becomes Cardelia, and Randy's name changes. And there is and there was never a plan once she gets to America on how she's supposed to find Randy. And she'll occasionally just ask somebody and they'll just say, I don't know. And then back to having sex. So
it turns out everybody actually knows Randy. Some people are engaged in trying to help. They take, Brigitte to heart, and they're like, we'll help you try to find Randy. And as it turns out, just about everybody actually knows. They go, oh, it's what is it? Randon Ransom, right? Oh, it's Randon. That's who you meant.
Randon.
Randy.
Oh, you mean Randon.
Randon Ransom,
Yeah,
which is the name Randy Ransom, by the way, is a little bit Ed-like. So if we try to plug ourselves into the thought process of people who have ascribed Ed Wood to this, that might be one little data point. I'm just saying. I'm not sure there's a whole lot of others, quite frankly, but that would be that's one that jumps out at me, actually.
I was looking for. Okay, there's a few things. If I were trying to convince other people that it was Ed, one little clue I would use is that Ed likes to use the word kaleidoscope to describe people's sensations when they're having sex. He likes to have them experience of colors, and this book uses a couple of kaleidoscope images, and there's one particular phrase. Grotto of love. There's one particular orifice described as a grotto of love, and I thought grotto of love. That's kind of Ed-like. So that is some. My favorite sentence in the whole book, though, was this. I had to write this down. They floated off together to the rhythm of a rock and roll. They floated off together to the rhythm of a rock and roll. Not a rock and roll song, not a rock and roll record, a rock and roll. They had a rock and roll. I guess they're at I've forgotten who was doing that. Probably Brigitte and somebody else. Oh, maybe when she went to, I have it written under my notes for the YMCA. So maybe she goes to the YMCA, which is, well, as the song says, it is fun to stay at the YMCA. Although that was later. That was much later than this.
Later. I think Charlene White, whomever Charlene White is, actually strives anyway at the very end of a chapter to sort of sum things up with one rather evocative statement. So you could have this chapter where there's just a whole bunch of sex going on, where there's a whole bunch of new characters being introduced, where it's narratively confounding and you don't know where the hell you're at. And then all of a sudden, the last sentence or two of the chapter is just something evocative to sort of send you off to the next chapter. And that's where the kaleidoscope comes in. I think it's actually the same sentence is repeated twice in the latter third of the book. And it's the very last sentence of the book. I didn't write the whole sentence down, but it starts off with, time passed like a kaleidoscope of flashing lights. There's a line earlier on, I didn't write it down, but I think it's something like infinity became finite and time stood still. Okay. And I'm like, what does that mean? Right? I'm sitting there, I'm like,
that is another thing, though, that might put it in the Ed Wood column, because Ed likes to talk about Ed likes to talk about infinity, oblivion, eternity. He likes those big concepts. He likes to talk about infinity, eternity, and oblivion. But I have to say, some of the best sentences in this book are the result of typos. Chuck Connolly is a polo player who has sex with Brigitte, but is not otherwise a very important character. And they're supposed to say, Chuck raised his head. But instead it says, Chuck raised his dead. And I thought about that joke about the old man and the old man and woman who go to the preacher and they say, like, heal my back, heal my legs, heal my feet. And he was like, he points down into his crotch, and then the old lady says, he said he could heal the sick, not raise the dead.
Right.
So I was like, oh, Chuck raised his dead. So I was like, I didn't think Chuck was raising the dead. Also, the other thing, though, this is all taking place a lot of this is taking place in high society on Long Island. And I guess this is the kind of the Long Island, of the Great Gatsby. Basically, it's that world again. Well, okay. When Family Guy did their parody of the Great Gatsby, they put Long Island 1923, and they're showing this row of mansions. And then the second caption said, Long Island used to be fancy. Because now Long Island, whenever it's brought up in popular culture, it's supposed to be like people talking like the nanny, people talking like Fran Drescher or something. Although she was obviously from Flushing, Queens, as the song says. But Long Island is supposed to be this very tacky place where everybody talks like this, And what we're seeing here is Long Island as it once was. This
Old
was
money, right?
old money.
Yep.
But then as Eyes Wide Shut and The Shining both illustrate, old money is sometimes some of the worst people, because they're like, these people are all moneyed, but they're also like, degenerates. They're all
they do nothing, they contribute nothing, right? They are essentially just vehicles for their own decadence, I guess. Right? I mean, a lot of these guys are, have this mother figure who obviously is keeping them afloat. A number of characters just in this book alone. That's fairly consistent actually with this picture of this old money type of thing, even outside of the boundaries of Mask of Evil. But I thought one thing was interesting, real quick, on page 1, they say, it said the Glenn Folks Society Orchestra could be heard in the background as the party was going. And it turns out the party's happening on Long Island Sound. So again, being me, I'm like, who the hell is Glenn Folks, right? I don't know if you guys...
is he real?
He's a real guy. He was a conductor for first the Walla Walla Symphony Orchestra and later the Portland Symphony Orchestra. He was born in 1878. So by this point, 1960, Glenn Folks is not, and I looked, I dug a little bit, I did a little bit of digging to try to validate what I was thinking, and I'm like, who the fuck is Glenn Folks, right? And the deeper I got into it, I'm like, he didn't travel. The Portland Symphony Orchestra, the Walla Walla Symphony Orchestra, they didn't travel around the country. So it made me think whoever wrote this is a little bit older, perhaps, or at least had a dad or an uncle or somebody who used to listen to the Glenn Folks Symphony Orchestra on the radio back in the day and are from the Northwest. It's a weird clue, but that's how sometimes my mind operates.
That's cool. This book is very specific about the places in Long Island. They're giving like very specific locations in Long Island, and so they'll say like Pelham, Westchester City, Long Island. They'll give like a full description of what this is. I've never been to Long Island. I don't know what that area of the world is still like. I know only two things. Again, first off, how it's presented in The Great Gatsby, and 2, how it's presented in pop culture nowadays.
Right.
And that Family Guy joke, Long Island used to be fancy, I thought kind of sums it all up, that it used to be this very rich, elegant place, and now it's come down in the world. I don't really know. I know whenever...
Yeah, I mean, certainly, wealthy families like the Rockefellers built large homes. That's where there was a time period where that's where they built their large homes outside of New York City to be, out in the country, so to speak. But that was really all. The tail end of those families would have been like the early 70s, at which point, post-war, it's post World War II, where you have the spread of the suburbs around New York City, and the change of Long Island from still being a lot of farms and open lands to just massive swaths of tract housing spreading. So that's really the change in the time period. Now, in the book, it's not clear whether the orchestra is actually physically present or not. The way it's stated, which makes me wonder, okay, so you're saying how old Glenn Folks would be by then, but maybe the restorative powers of the rites of Aphrodite have kept him going.
Maybe. Glenn Folks, who knows, right?
He's almost like Jack from The Shining,
Well,
yeah, he's always been the...
I knew somebody was going to mention Eyes Wide Shut, certainly, inevitably, but I didn't think The Shining was going to come up.
Let me ask you this. There's one mystery. Okay, I never was able to understand, and because I just couldn't keep track of this. Okay, obviously, you know how in many stories, two characters will know that they were long lost siblings or lovers or something because they have like two halves of a pendant or something.
Or even
Well,
like
in this, they
yeah.
have the matching tattoos, right? Randy has a tattoo,
Right.
and Maddie has a tattoo that matches.
They do. Well, no, they don't match. They have
They
they
go
have each
together.
other's sexual organ as
Yeah,
a
yeah,
tattoo.
Okay, so
yeah.
he has Maddie's
Vagina.
sex organ, vagina
Right.
tattooed on his thigh.
He does. Exactly. In blue and pink. Yeah.
Okay, because, and then I guess
She
the
has a
reverse
picture of his dick.
Doesn't every?
right.
I mean, have you not been in a?
I don't know. It just seems like that would be like. It just seems like during the actual sex act, that would be like visually confusing.
You did say, Joe, you've never been to Long Island. You don't know, right? You don't
I mean,
know what
it
it's
just
like.
seems like that would be like if a guy were about to have sex with a woman, I don't like the last thing he would want to see before insertion is his own penis on the other side.
It's great.
Like
It's when there's another one that's been inked over that then you have to worry,
Yeah. That's
so.
I won't even reply to that. I've experienced that personally. So it's about halfway through the book. Actually, Brigitte thinks she sees the tattoo during the rite, and she thinks she spots it very quickly, and then she loses sight of it, and she's like, "Oh, I think I saw it." And so we're only halfway through the book at that point.
Well,
from that point forward, like the writer has exhausted the narrative and doesn't know what to do next, because then the chapters shrink to 4 or 5 pages often for the remainder of the book, and they are just one new character introduced and one new sexual escapade after another for the whole entire rest of the book, as if I'm filling pages right now. And it becomes, quite frankly, for me, it got boring at that point.
It didn't get boring for me because it was like a jigsaw puzzle with either too many pieces or not enough. And I was trying to piece it together. I didn't really care if she was going to New York City for shopping excursions, although I guess that does lead to things. She meets people there, but like her going shopping for hats or something, and then that turns into a big sex encounter. I think she's like window shopping and she looks at a hat,
right?
And then the guy gives her a haircut, like an enforced haircut that she doesn't want, so that the hat fits better. And I was like, are like forced haircuts, like, is that a sex fetish for somebody? Is that like a thing that people are like? I'm not ruling that out as like I'm sure there's somewhere in the world there is a sex story where the woman is like pinned down and like the guy like gives her a haircut or something that she doesn't want, because people can fetishize anything or sexualize anything. So I didn't get the point of giving her the haircut that she didn't want just so the hat would fit better. I don't know. Who gives her the hat? Was that Mr. John? Is that Mr.
Well, Mr. John, she's window shopping, as you said, and then actually immediately, again, trying to honor the notion that somebody somewhere along the line thought this is an Ed Wood book. I thought I'll try to keep my mind open and attuned to what moments might suggest that. So there's that window shopping moment where Brigitte's window shopping, and I thought about obviously the scene in Glen or Glenda, the window shopping scene. So she spots a turban, and she's happens to be a little bit taken by it, and the next thing you know, she's got kind of a tap on the shoulder, and it's Mr. John, and Mr. John just happens to be the hat maker, and he's like, come on in, you can try it on. And next thing you know, he's inviting her to a party, and Mr. Gaspard is his couture, the clothes designer, and Mr. John makes only the hats. So she ends up going to a party at Mr. John's, and when she arrives, there are 4 nude men sitting on the floor. What are they playing? I'm making this
I wrote that down.
Tiddlywinks? I don't even
nude men playing tiddlywinks. It says in my notes.
Right.
I said, Mr. John, a hat maker on Madison Avenue, cuts her hair, invites her to a party where there are nude men playing tiddlywinks. And I thought, somebody in the world, again, the world has billions of people in it. A lot of them are messed up. for somebody, tiddlywinks is their thing.
Right.
Like it can't be Candyland. It can't be Chutes and Ladders.
Well,
Has to be tiddlywinks. They can't be playing nude Monopoly. They can't be playing Monopoly. They can't be playing Battleship. It has to be nude men playing tiddlywinks. So I had to write that down. I had to write that.
When you, 2 or paragraphs later, it's like then they were playing a game of Ring Around the Rosie, and next thing you know, somebody loses. And what losing in that game means is, of course, that you're going to be essentially anally penetrated by everyone else playing the game, right? It's like, what? And Brigitte, to your point earlier, Joe, where she's kind of an innocent as she moves through all of this, it doesn't faze her. Very little phases her about any of this experience that she's having.
Well, and that's how I viewed that whole Tiddlywinks episode, that this was, they could have been drawing lots to see who was going to get it. They were just playing a game, and the loser was going to, be the receptacle at the end of the game.
Receptacle, what a lovely word. Lovely word choice, Jim. Receptacle.
Mask of Evil. The Mask of
I
Evil.
wrote down so many characters. I wrote down Angelo, John's gardener. Does Angelo end up doing anything in his book? He's just in it for a while.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But you were talking about adjectives. My favorite adjective that was used was to describe Maddie and Randy's relationship, and it was halcyonic. They're halcyonic days, and I thought, what a nice turn of phrase. Thank you, Mask of Evil, for that lovely, genuinely lovely, I'm not being sarcastic with this time.
Right.
Halcyonic, that is nice. I also like Grotto of Love, but that was for different reasons. I liked, but it's so much like it's what a non-rich person might think that a rich person's tastes are, because what do rich people do? They play polo. So that's why we have 2 polo players in this thing. It's because, but doesn't Tom doesn't Daisy's husband in The Great Gatsby, isn't he play polo as well? Isn't he he's like a jock? I gotta find that. I gotta remember that.
I don't remember.
It's been a while since I've read The Great Gatsby, but
that would be a pretty phenomenal catch, Joe, if Mask of Evil were somehow
well, okay, again,
The Great Gatsby.
Well, okay, it's like I said, it's the same world.
Right.
Great Gatsby is supposed to be on Long Island in the his is obviously the 1920s instead of the 1960s, but it's that world of rich people. And what's Great Gatsby always doing in the book? Throwing parties. He's throwing parties every few pages. And Gatsby is longing for a long lost lover. So I don't say that this is. I think this was partly inspired by The Great Gatsby. Let me see here. Tom Buchanan is the guy. Tom Buchanan. Let me see. What does he do, man? Tom Buchanan. He is hyper masculine, unlikable. Let's see.
Mask of Evil, the great Gatsby for our time.
I really didn't expect we would get to The Great Gatsby. I was not expecting that.
Well, I was thinking that book
beautiful.
To the whole
this
thing.
Is beautiful. It does. It really does. And this is, an object.
Yeah, I mean,
object lesson for us.
Even for 1963.
Okay.
It is at best invoking a world that is fast disappearing from the stage.
Right.
Well,
right.
Gatsby reveals his contempt for Tom Buchanan when he calls him, quote unquote, the polo player. So, yes, Tom Buchanan is a polo player. There's 2 polo players in this Mask of Evil.
Yeah.
That's not a coincidence. There's Tommy Watkins and his buddy Chuck
Connolly.
Chuck Connolly. There's 2 polo players in this thing.
I think he has ED, right? Chuck Connolly can't get it up. Yeah.
So
Poor guy.
And getting back to sort of the turn of the century, if you will, reference to the Glen Folk Society Orchestra, that same time period, we're talking, we're current day Upper Harlem is, you still had what came to be known as the Polo Grounds, where the New York Giants baseball team played. You know, before they came along in the early 19s, that was a big a series of polo fields that the wealthy
I never even wondered. I never even thought
So-
about why the polo grounds were called that. I didn't ever think
either.
of them actually playing polo there.
Right.
because it was polo match grounds right until they sold it for the baseball field to be built on
Wow.
it in
So-
like the 1900 somethings, if I remember
But, you know,
correctly.
When you were saying, Jim, earlier about how the wealthy families were maybe getting out of Long Island by like the 60s and into the 70s, what I was thinking then was exactly what you just said, was that this Mask of Evil book is kind of about the last few years of rich people living in Long Island. This was kind of the end of that old money living in Long Island era. And I just had, while we've been doing this, I had to look into where is Grey Gardens, and was Grey Gardens supposed to be in? No, Grey Gardens is in the Hamptons.
Okay.
And so now when I think of rich people in New York State, I think of the Hamptons. I think that they're going
Right.
to the Hamptons.
Or you even go further north, right? You go to Martha's Vineyard and things like that, right? You think of that's the high society taking place there. I'm gonna take a bathroom break, guys. I will be right back,
okay.
but I'm not gonna stop the recording. Keep going. This is actually turning out to be. I never expected this conversation was gonna go in the directions it's going. This is fascinating. I'll be right back.
No,
Yeah, he'll be. So we can just keep going here. I part of me felt guilty sending you the images to read, but now with what we've all seemed to have mined out of this, as usual, it's it just every one of these books that I read out of this era has just made me want to know who it was that wrote it, because when you start, even the they obviously span a rather wide quality range. I've certainly seen that in my readings, that you have books that were written by folks that were barely literate, to be quite frank, and others that were clearly written by people with a good command of the English language. And let's not kid ourselves. Not early 1960s was a time period when top dollar was being paid for this kind of material. So it's not that we should wonder necessarily why someone who did write this kind of material. It's that it's sold and it could put money in your pocket for sure.
Well, the strange thing about Mask of Evil is that there are occasional turns of phrase or passages that are actually kind of elegant, and thoughtful in their own weird way. And yet there'll be some things that are just so outrageously amateurish. It's this novel's kind of all over the place. So I would have definitely told whoever wrote this, definitely do a second draft. You have try to focus on what this novel is about. The other thing, though, is that we haven't really discussed here is novels like this are written for a very specific audience for a very specific reason. How well do you think Mask of Evil actually functions as erotica? How erotic do you find it?
Do you want to take that question, Jim?
Jim.
Well, okay. So just to put it on a spectrum, you go back a decade earlier, when you had Venus Press and some other publishers in New York putting out hardcover erotica that had to be privately sold. To our modern eyes, if you read one of those, quite often you can read an entire book in and say, where were the naughty bits? And you have to go back, and then you'll find like some sentences that are so elliptical that only with some thought do you realize, oh, okay, they're really tangentially hinting at intercourse here, right? So then a decade later now, what's interesting about this series is, I'll bring up another first nighter, Dial P for Pleasure by Byron Kozlov. And so we have Mask of Evil published in 66, P for Pleasure 64. It's actually 2 years earlier. And it is so much more explicit that I can imagine they probably had customers who were hoping for this kind of content and got this and were disappointed.
Well, I would say that Mask of Evil is, I have to say 90% of the, or 99% of the sex books that I've read, I've not written any, are Ed Wood's. So are the actual Ed Wood ones. And Ed can go anywhere from pretty raunchy to all the way disgusting. He can go, especially as you get down into the 70s, he gets dirtier and dirtier and nastier and nastier. And then I would say to your comparison here, that Mask of Evil does find a balance. You won't wonder where the dirty parts are. There are dirty parts every few pages, but it doesn't get like it doesn't get so crude and so raunchy that it's absolutely disgusting. So it's I guess it's pretty soft stuff, but not all the way though. Compared to what you would, I don't know what would count as a spicy novel in those days. Peyton Place. I read Peyton Place,
right?
And Peyton Place it has some spicy scenes in it. This is more a delivery system for this book. Is at heart, this is a delivery system for sex scenes. I mean, we have a story that goes through it, and there is sort of a plot that you can follow all the way through it. It's Brigitte trying to reunite Maddie and Randy. But really, this is a delivery system for sex scenes. And those are not difficult to find. They're not ambiguous as to what, is supposed to be happening. As you say, there are some quote unquote sex novels where it's so abstracted and so genteel that, you'd have to read between the lines to figure out where the sex stuff is. So I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know that this book uses I didn't make a note of it, but I don't know that this book uses a lot of what we would call profanities. I don't think it does. I don't think it does.
No,
not at all.
So
this ends up being a good example of how you can avoid profanities, but yet still be amazingly explicit for 1964 about all sorts of acts. I just bring that up because it's, I've only read a handful of books from this publisher, but they're sort of all over the map as far as writing quality, explicitness. I think it was just a very erratic product.
Do you think that the Raincoat Brigade or the dirty bookstore patrons of 1966, do you think they got their money's worth out of Mask of Evil?
Well, let me go back and I'll answer that as well as I think Jim's previous question, which is it is very euphemistic. This is 1966, by the way, so there's not a lot of graphic language here. You won't hear the word cock, you won't hear the word cunt. I'm just being extremely explicit because 10 years later, you would hear those words profligately all over the place, but not here. But what this does, though, is I think it does actually paint a picture of sexual violence in the scenes where people give in to being, whipped or beaten and things like that during the sex act. That's kind of surprising for 1966. That actually surprised me a little bit from the standpoint of the time frame. I also started thinking, I think it's brilliant, the early notion of some bits and pieces might be related to, kind of Bride of Dracula type of narrative, but also The Great Gatsby. So we're finding all kinds of correspondences here. But I think at the end of the day, Marquis de Sade, you mentioned it, Joe, I think, Marquis de Sade, this is very much like Justine, just like Juliet, or
Right.
Justine and Juliet. It's the girl is just going to get taken through this experience where everywhere she goes, she's going to encounter somebody, whether they're male, they're female, they're young or old, who is wired principally towards having sex, right? So,
well, that's another way, I guess, that you could describe this book is inspired a little bit by Justine. So it's a little bit like sort of a dumbed down or simplified Justine, I guess. It's in a little ways like I think the Marquis de Sade is certainly a touchstone for this book a little bit. I'm not sure how much. What is the lady's name? Charlene White. Charlene White. I'm not sure how much de Sade she is, because when de Sade is actually mentioned by name, I think it's in a scene involving being spanked with ping pong paddles.
Yeah, ping pong paddles.
Which I'm not sure that that's specifically what de Sade had in mind. Now, if they had said Aleister Crowley, that would be that guy.
Bring a little Satan into it. Right?
Well, no, Crowley was into some sex stuff that made de Sade. De Sade was mostly, I don't know that he did as much as he wrote about.
But
Crowley,
his writing was bad enough. I mean, if you've read widely
but Crowley was not just about the writing. Crowley was into doing.
Well, yes. I mean, you had ritualistic sex for purposes of,
and so Crowley makes de Sade look, like Mary Poppins in comparison, but I'm sorry to say my only experience with Justine is seeing like movie versions of it. I've not actually.
I think,
and L. Ron Hubbard could tell us all about the rites of Eros that he underwent with the Crowley group in California in the 1940s before he was a known entity.
Geez. Getting into the Jack Parsons stuff, right?
Well, no, Jack, he was Jack Parsons' receptacle during sex magic workings. Yeah, I mean that's.
Well, there was a very indulgent Edward Wednesday's article I wrote one time where I said I'd been locked away with these Ed Wood movies and books for so long that I felt like Crowley performing this. I forgot what the name of the rite was, but he like locked himself away for months in a castle to perform this very complicated and time-consuming satanic ritual. And he eventually just got bored with it and never finished it. So it's kind of like it was this really long ritual that he devoted months of his life to and then didn't do. He did like some of it and then just kind of gave up on it and was like, to hell with this. This is boring. I'm tired of being locked away in this castle. And I said, well, writing Edward Wednesdays has been like that for me. I felt like I've been locked away with these movies and I'm forced to like have this almost monastic devotion to writing about, trash, basically what's considered pop cultural trash. And let's not use euphemisms here. Mask of Evil would probably be considered the garbage of literature. I mean, it's like trash level literature. I mean, there's very little literary pretension to this. But as you also said, what was the cover price on this thing?
It would have been,
75 maybe?
50 cents,
Wow.
going upwards to 75 cents, depending. Well, it's marked 95 cents, but that series generally went for 50 to 75 cents. when
Yeah,
it first
95
came.
cents is kind of
Was that-
expensive for 66. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I've been surprised by when I
Now,
find
that being said, a lot of it was sold mail order and they would discount it. So it'd be these things where you'd see the ad in the magazine.
The
or
such
it'd
and
be
such book club, right?
Pick
Yeah.
any 10 novels for
Right.
$5 kind of thing. So while it may have had that cover price, whether you paid that or anyway, sorry, Joe.
Well, no, it's just that one thing that surprised me sometimes in finding out about the Pendulum books and publications is how expensive they were. And when you factor in inflation, those books and magazines sometimes that Pendulum put out, those were pricey. Those were an investment at the time, because you'd be spending, sometimes for some of those books and things, you'd be spending like the equivalent of $50 or $75 basically, for a dirty book, basically. So I was just wondering, like, in the book market, in the paperback book market of 1966, would this have been about on par with, what else was being sold in the shops at that time? Like if you were to buy like a paperback book of a Agatha Christie novel at that time, what was that going to run you?
I mean, the prices we're seeing, the cover prices we're seeing here is basically equivalent to the cover price of a mainstream paperback a decade later. So yeah,
Okay.
they were markedly more expensive at the time
Okay.
they came
Well,
out. And that's because you had a motivated and horny market that was gonna pay,
Sure.
Well, then, Greg writes all about the loops. That's a whole other level of expense. That is like,
They're expensive as hell, right?
ooh,
50 bucks.
Man, oh man.
50 bucks in
that's-
1972 or 3.
You are spending, you are shelling out some serious cash. And of course you have to have your own projector. You probably have to have your own screen.
You have to wait till your mom's out running errands to have your
To-
friends over
You
to
do,
project it on the
right?
wall of the house.
Well,
That's so
Hey.
I've heard. So I've heard.
hey, now you see, every time I get to talk about this kind of stuff on the Happy Days podcast, I do, because there is a couple of stories where, they pass around dirty paperbacks amongst themselves. That's a running joke in the first couple of seasons, but there is one where they buy a film, a mail order film, and Richie's family is the only family with a projector and a screen. So they have to go over to Richie's house to watch it, even though he's suffering from the Asiatic flu. And that's a whole thing. Does anybody remember the Asiatic flu?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
So
Mhm.
Asiatic flu.
That's a politically loaded statement. Right?
Well, Asiatic flu is what they called it.
Yeah.
It was called the Asiatic flu. And that's a big running joke through the first couple of seasons of Happy Days. They're always talking about the Asiatic flu. And then finally Richie gets the Asiatic flu. And then I had to look into that, like, what was the Asiatic flu? And then that was a whole flu pandemic in the 50s.
Right.
But they go over to his house specifically to watch the movie because they send away for, like, it's like the Girls of Tahiti or something, it's some sort of nudie travelogue something. And it turns out to be a ripoff once they get it. But that's a whole other level of expense. And when I reviewed the Tom of Finland, book that Ed wrote,
Circus.
That was, I think, relatively expensive for the time.
$10 cover price.
So, this stuff wasn't necessarily cheap, but you have, as you say, a motivated buyer. They really, I'm going to say this. I don't think that the buyer of Mask of Evil, if they could get through the incomprehensible plot and the typos literally in every sentence, practically some of them, it's very rare that there's even a full paragraph that doesn't have a couple of bloopers in it. I think they would have been satiated to some extent by this book because we do have the archetype in pornography and adult entertainment of the French chambermaid. And I'm sure the name Brigitte, I'm sure that was probably in reference to Brigitte Bardot. I'm sure that they're
Right.
so. Does Brigitte actually do any chambermaiding?
Not really. No.
She's
not
carrying
really.
she's carrying a tray at the very beginning, and that gets lost pretty quickly.
It's-
Well, you know,
She is a
see it, but-
virgin. She's actually a virgin at the beginning of the book. It doesn't
but,
last
you know,
long. Yeah.
But you know, to one of your points, you know, we do, when you read this stuff, you do have to remind yourself to put yourself in the mindset that of 1966 and what was available then. It's very easy to forget the context.
Yeah.
That regardless of what we may think about the content of one of these books, this could have been like manna raining from the heavens for someone who did not have access
I mean,
to almost anything
a
else.
high school kid
nine-
getting a hold of this would have been gold if you were like 15 or
Yeah.
something and you got a hold of a copy of Mask of Evil. Man, this
Yeah.
is getting passed around. And
Sure, you'd be popular.
well, you know,
real quick. Yeah.
so I always pictured her as sort of looking like Brigitte Bardot, and I imagined her, although I don't think it ever says that she does, but dressed in the French chambermaid costume, you know, which I think is still a Halloween costume that you can get still
Yeah,
to this
sure,
day.
of
Well, you know,
course, right?
that thing is such a common archetype that, you know, the movie, Beauty and the Beast, the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast, is set in France, but only a couple of the characters actually have French accents. Almost everybody has an American accent in that movie. A couple of people have British accents, but one of the few characters who has a French accent is the chambermaid.
Yeah.
And the chambermaid is, you know, she's a faiseur duster, you know, she's a faiseur duster, and she's, you know, and she's clearly supposed to be a sexualized, feather duster.
Isn't it
because-
1964 Diary of a Chambermaid came out by Louis Buñuel's film with
Buñuel's film.
Jean Moreau and Fernando Rey, right? And of course he has a foot fetish for the chambermaid, and of course there's a sexual undercurrent in the film, so to speak. Not that it has anything
See,
to do
Buñuel
with this Mask of Evil, but
Buñuel should have directed the film version of this novel. You see, that's what should have happened. Is
the
Buñuel.
Mask of Mephisto, right? I'm gonna
Oh,
order. If I had it, I would have worn it on this podcast, people. I don't have a Mask of Mephisto, but that's
Well,
the
you know-
Mask of Evil, for lack
So
of a better
just
term, in the
some
book
slight-
itself.
Well, you know,
Just some-
Buñuel, he could keep things hot. He had a certain sense of eroticism in his films. He
Mhm.
could do that very effectively.
So
Sure.
just some slight additional framing, and that would be that so far everything that I've seen from this publisher, sort of universals across all of the books are bondage and discipline and S&M and the unwanted, and like I said, the unwanted sexual assault that turns into the, hey, thanks for that experience.
Right.
And so I think that, you know, they had certain tropes that they were pushing, and they come through, like I said, in some books stronger and more. They were definitely, you know, the normal sex you will find in these books are heterosexual couples swapping.
Yeah.
Right. That's as sort of vanilla as it gets. For the most part, I had to send, well, when I was reading this about a week or so ago, in the middle of the night, I sent Greg a text message with a snapshot of a page, and I just said, oh no, Greg, the protagonist just dropped the soap in the shower.
Yeah. It happens.
Um,
It happens too
and
often.
you knew it was coming next, you know?
That cover, by the way, Jim, Dial P for Pleasure, that's a Stanton, clearly. That is a
Yeah.
fucking brilliant Stanton tableau. That is on the scale, if you were really paying close attention to the covers, you would be like, that is brilliant Stanton. Look how the guy
Now
is in the
this
shadows, right?
actually
The women are
follows
very powerful, right?
the guy's calling and he's got his hand in his pocket. He may
Yeah,
be,
yeah.
maybe he needs more change because it's a tall call, or maybe not.
Sure.
You know, this cover, actually, getting to your point about Mask of Evil, this is sort of the opposite in that the cover actually tells you the plot of the book.
Yeah.
In that there's this hotel that has a ringtone reserved for, the letter you dial P on the phone to get hooked up to the main usher's number, and you just tell them, what sort of sex you're interested in, what you would like, and they send it up to your room. So, it's like that red-headed bellboy who was really tall. Is he free right now? Send him on up. The lady from 201, could you give her a ring and see if she'd be interested in some anal sex? Send her along. And that's what this whole book is about.
No, so that's Byron Kozlov. So
who was
right.
Byron Kozlov was one of the many pseudonyms of a guy by the name of Paul Hugo Litwinski, who changed his name to Paul Hugo Little. Generally appears to be acknowledged as the second most prolific novelist known to history, over 700 novels, published under at least a dozen pseudonyms. He was he was that rare Renaissance man, extremely well educated, master level chess player, wrote all sorts of articles under his own name about food and music criticism and chess theory. And meanwhile, he's writing well-written, very literate, but extremely graphic sleaze porn by the mid 60s.
Well, you blew my mind recently when you told me about Litwinski, and I was like, "Whoa, 700 books plus, and across so many different publishers, and so many, to your point, so many different AKAs, right?" So it took me deep into even the Eros Gold Stripe paperbacks in the early mid 70s, where he is also Larry Preston and Lana Preston and Jack Warren. He actually, Paul Little, for lack of a better way of describing it, let's call him Paul Little, Hugo Litwinski, Paul Little. He uses the word Angora quite frequently in his texts. Somehow, in some crazy other world, I was able to get somebody to scan over 18,000 adult paperbacks and show me what hit on the word Angora. And a lot of them are actually Paul Little books.
So I have to say, from the little bit of his that I've read, no pun intended, one of the things that jumped out as immediately diagnostic with his work, aside from for this genre, the high quality of the writing, is sex scene after sex scene after sex scene that is much more interested in describing the man's musculature than anything else that's occurring in the scene. Much more interested in describing that than anyone's. Now, there are descriptions of people's clothing and everything, don't get me wrong, but when you read his sex scenes, what you come away with was that the eye, the God's eye in all those scenes is looking at the man's musculature and describing in great detail its movement during sex acts and things like that. So if you want to infer anything about him from that, I don't know, but it certainly was unusual and not, I originally picked up some of his stuff to read because he was so prolific in the First Nighter and After Hours series. I got to thinking, well, is there any chance that he is Charlene White? Well, yeah,
no
way. And
well, that brings us, I mean, we haven't actually,
Right.
we haven't actually asked the big question. We're almost 2 hours in this podcast. We haven't asked the big question. So Greg, do you want to ask that big question?
Did Ed Wood write this book? Did Ed Wood write Mask of Evil?
You
That's
know,
the
I read
question.
I read this over a decade ago and thought no. And after rereading it again recently with even more Ed experience for what it's worth, I would still say no. Like you say, there are these little things in there that have seemed to have a little resonance with things that Ed might, you know, Randy Ransom, little turns of phrase and whatnot. But for me, there just wasn't enough of it. None of it. It just didn't add up.
Right.
I'm also going to have to say no. I previously cited an adjective, halcyonic, and that just struck me as a word that Ed would never use.
Right.
Ed would never describe something as halcyonic. But I've been so immersed in Ed's books the last couple of months, I've made my way through maybe 30 or more of them just in the last few months. They don't take long to get through if you really just, there are certain words that I now know to look for. Ed's favorite verb, I think, in the whole world must be lowered. He lowered his head, she lowered her leg, he lowered her voice, he lowered her onto the bed. I was looking for lowards. There's no lowards. Ed's favorite furniture in the world is a divan, which is a low-backed couch.
Right.
Every single character practically in his novels has a divan. And this is a whole novel about rich people, and it all takes place in mansions. And I don't think I found a single divan in this whole book. So just the
in French, that would be a recamier, and there wasn't one of those either for Brigitte.
Well, now one thing that he does that is a little bit like, Ed-like, is that Ed wrote a book called Parisian Passions,
Right.
which is not to be confused with Prison Passion, which is another Ed book, which is quite a grim work altogether. Jesus, what was Ed going through when he wrote Prison Passion? But Parisian Passion, it's set in Paris, obviously, and there's little French phrases woven all through it. And every time somebody speaks in French, I think it's italicized. And so that same thing happens here. Occasionally, Brigitte will drop in a phrase that's in French, and it'll be italicized. The characters in this drink martinis. There's like Ed would go through phases in his drinking, I think. So he must have been going through like a bourbon phase, a gin phase, a martini phase, because like in one book, they'll all be drinking bourbon, and then the next book, they'll all be drinking martinis. But Ed doesn't have a patent on the martini. I think that was just a 60s drink. So, it's what you think of like the Rat Pack having, it was martinis. So I can't say that martinis it's a thing that Ed would use. Ed would like to have his characters have martinis. Kaleidoscopes, but Ed doesn't have a patent on kaleidoscopes either. He uses the word kaleidoscope occasionally. But one thing that Ed loves to do is say sentences like this. Her dream was just that, a dream. The past was only that, the past. Like he has to explain the thing that he just said. And, when the couples paired up, there was so many homosexual encounters going on. The men went with the women. The men went with the men, and the women went with the women. Like he'll have to say the whole thing. Like in Glenn or Glenda, there's this phrase about sex changes: man to woman, woman to man. Ed loves to have that kind of symmetry.
Right.
And the one thing that I notice a lot in Ed's writing is the thing that I call the Wood reversal, which is like, I've spent so many lonely days, or should I say nights? He does the Ed Wood reversal. He does those kinds of things. I should say, or should I say, he loves to have those kind of reversals. And another thing that Ed loves to do that this writer does not do at all is what I call Ed's two-worders or his three-worders. that's when Ed doesn't have a convenient one-word term for something. He'll stick together two words into his own clunky neologism, I guess, his own new phrase, like she would do anything to get her sex joys. Like he'll just take sex and joy and he'll put those together and make a noun out of that. She was into the bed scene, she didn't like this paddling routine, like those two-worders and three-worders where Ed has just taken two words and putting them together. He does that in every book, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, those little clunky, the thing that the only thing I can relate it to is there's a comedian, Paul F. Tompkins, who tells this story about working in a hat store. And he knew it was time to quit when he had two different customers refer to a crown as a king hat. He said, king hat, this word, crown. Crown. It's not a word you've never heard before. Crown. Why would you call it a king hat? So I suppose you're not going to be spending any of your value papers at our store. So if you would please go to our go away hole, being the door. So I thought king hat, that's very typical of how Ed writes. He doesn't have a convenient one-word term. He will Frankenstein one together. And Charlene White does not do that, and certainly doesn't do that with the regularity that Ed does. There's no lowards. I don't think a lot of talk about sweaters. Ed will work in sweaters as often as he possibly can. Ed doesn't like to go too long without steering the conversation towards any one of what I call his three muses, which are death, things of death. He will have characters mention cemeteries and burials and all that. He'll just have them mention that out of nowhere. He likes to do that very frequently. Booze. Now there is booze in here, but not as much as Ed would like it to be, and women's clothing.
Right.
And Ed will take any topic that he's writing about and he will work it towards those three things: sex, booze, and women's clothing, whether it's convenient to or it isn't. And I just getting that from Mask of Evil. Now, not that it was not a worthwhile reading experience because it was so bizarre and it's such a peek into another era. Now, we were talking, I don't know if this was in the recording or if it was before we started recording, but Greg, you used to do a lot of articles and stuff about, here's something that Ed didn't write. Here's an article Ed didn't write. Here's a book that Ed didn't write. Here's sometimes a film Ed didn't make. And you did a lot of that. And I was like, good, it's interesting, but I would always say, you got to work in references to Ed. I would tell you in the emails, I would say, you got to work in more references to Ed in this, because, if you start looking into Ed, you find other writers of the period, you find other books and other movies and things that were happening around the same time. And it's easy to get 2 steps away from Ed, 3 steps away from Ed. I think this might be a step, this might be a couple steps away from Ed. Ed could have written a novel like this. I don't say that the plot is beyond the kind of thing that he would have written. Of course, it was published, as you said, on the East Coast. But Greg, didn't he have some stuff published? Didn't Bernie publish some of his stuff when Bernie was still in Georgia? Wasn't there, or
very early on? You're talking about Atlanta. You're talking about Atlanta Pendulum. In fact, I think you mentioned one of the titles earlier, which was, is it Paris Passion? I don't even remember. There were those handful of mostly photo illustrated.
Okay, someday I'm going to have. I didn't know how many. I didn't realize how many of those Parisian Passion, but yeah, how many of those photo-based books there are, and that's some of Ed's freakiest stuff. Is the photo.
I think there's like 4 known, and I think only a couple of them are kind of ironclad Ed, raped in the grass. Well, it was enough. Bye bye Brody. But I think the others, I think the Erotic Spy actually, although it's sort of, this is a topic for another day, obviously.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic.
but I think the erotic spy is actually Ed. I do. A lot of people think it's not, but Parisian Passion, I'd have to look into.
Well, Parisian Passion is the one that was. Parisian Passion is definitely Ed because it's got Buck Rhodes in it and the same sheriff that was in other novels that he wrote. I think the same sheriff that's in Devil Girls is in this one. He wrote a few things with this sheriff character. Prison Passion is something else. Prison Passion is this another photo-based book.
Yeah.
And Prison Passion is about two ladies who escape from prison, and then one forces the other into a lesbian relationship, and then it ends up with one of the girls being drawn and quartered. And there's like a photo feature to go with it. And my version just has the words, doesn't have the pictures. I've seen some of the pictures, including the picture of the woman being drawn and quartered. And it's obviously like a mannequin that's been pulled apart. But the fact that he has an erotic novel that ends in a drawing and quartering is, but I always had to wonder about those things. Like they started with the photos, did they start with the photos and then they sent that to the writer to write it up?
I think so. Yeah, he's writing to order around the photos. And the same thing he did with the Pendulum magazines very often with the pictorial texts in the Pendulum magazines. Give Ed a photo feature and he'll give you something around it. Some of it's interesting. There's one thing he talks a lot about, let's do what comes naturally, right? That's a very Ed-like sort of statement in the pictorial text. That happens here a little bit later when Brigitte says to Harper, let's do what comes naturally, which is you have oral sex with me right after I've had sex with Andrew. So there's interesting thing. I'm not saying by any means that I think Ed Wood wrote Mask of Evil, but there's enough here for me to understand why somebody else may have thought so. And Joe froze up. Are you there, Joe? Or at least on my screen.
Joe dropped off
Joe.
now.
I think we lost Joe. He was offended by my statement. He was offended, right?
Well, should we?
Yeah, we should. Not so funny. Not so funny.
So along these lines of wondering about Charlene White, as I said, so far in all the searching I've done, I've only come across one other novel attributed to Charlene White, and that's After Hours number 145, Not So Funny, also published in 1966, same year as Mask of Evil.
Is that a Stanton cover? I mean, you held it up quickly, but that looks like a Stanton cover to a degree. Yeah,
maybe.
so.
I'm not sure.
Maybe.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
The cover on this one is vaguely mimics the plot in that there is a clown and there is a woman ultimately who gets dolled up like this, who's the main character, Olga. The plot on that, now comparing the two, shame Joe isn't on for this. This is sort of somewhat of a complicated plot, an explosion of characters. This is a very simple, straightforward plot. A quarter of the characters, if that. The basic plot is, of course it starts off with the unwanted rape of the main character that turns into the thank you experience, and that's Olga, who's raped by an older man. But then she's a waitress, and she meets this guy and falls in love, who's just traveling through town, and they quickly fall in love and they get married, and he whisks her back to his life in the circus. He's a big cat, tame, like a lion tamer in the circus, okay? And so what the book basically is about is this outsider coming into the circus world, which it's a relatively small circus. I think there's only about, well, regardless of what the size of the circus may be, there's perhaps only about 4 or 5 characters from that world that get introduced to you through Olga. And they all fall in one of 2 camps of either liking her or hating her. There's the inevitable woman in the circus that Chet was the guy she married. Chet was, you know, this other woman he was supposed to marry. So she now immediately has it in for Olga throughout the book. And the book essentially just is Olga taking her lumps from various people in this circus setting until by the end of the book, she's finally accepted as one of them. It's, like I said, it's a very flat and affectless book that is almost adjective free. Certainly unlike the kinds of things that Ed would write, where he would lovingly describe, especially women's clothing. There's almost no descriptors in this book whatsoever. It's as if it made me think of when I saw, you know, some shots from science fiction shows before they've added in all the digital special effects, and the actors and actresses are just on this sound stage, and the room around them is just gray particle board, because all the details that you're going to see in the final product is digitally created and doesn't exist. You know, there's almost no description whatsoever in this book. So the circus is just the circus. There's no descriptions of anything. It doesn't. So it effectively doesn't. Nothing in this world of the book looks like anything. You can't describe it in any way. It's just the trailer, the circus, the town, the village, the street, and the limit of description is she had a pretty dress on. That's it. So the book has this very odd feel to it because of that. And it's this very simplistic plot of driving forward to this point of where she's accepted in the circus world and is now going to have an okay life there. There are a couple of little subplots along the way, but they're really pretty minor. They're, again, for this time, you know, indicative of this series of books in this time period, there's lots of forced sex scenes that then turn into, well, thank you for that experience. I probably wouldn't have tried that unless you had raped me. They don't say that, but that's essentially what it comes down to. And the one thing that stood out in this book is there is, in the middle of the book, a 3-page sequence that could only be described as like something out of a fever dream or an acid flashback, or where actually it's the clown Elmer, who, you know, now all along through this novel, you don't get any impression about the circus other than it's some sort of flea bag circus of that time period that's going town to town. At the end of the book, when Elmer is murdered, which is completely sort of unrelated to what was going on, suddenly we find out that he's the world's most famous circus clown, and apparently the planet is mourning. Anyway, in the middle of the book, Elmer suddenly says to Olga, "Hey, let's go into the village. Let's get out of here and go into the village." And so they go down into this unspecified village that the circus is sitting outside of for a time. And Elmer just knows some particular rundown looking house to go into. And they go in there, and it's like you're suddenly in some, like I said, some acid flashback where they're passing through rooms filled with naked people who are sort of standing there motionless and then come to life suddenly with some prompting from Elmer.
The clown.
Yeah, the clown. And they start to interact with Olga. And then Elmer takes this young boy by the hand, and they pass through a mirrored section of wall. And then Olga can see Elmer and this boy start to do things in some other like almost liminal space. And then she wakes up and she's just like laying outside of this sort of ruined house, and other people from the circus are around her and she doesn't really remember what happened. I mean, it is just such a, it's like a weird nugget of bizarre, like sexual sci-fi that just like suddenly plunges into this book out of nowhere. And it's about 3 pages long.
It sounds like a fucking David Lynch movie, right? It sounds crazy.
Well, thank
right.
you. That is a great analogy. So Joe, we were talking about not so funny when you dropped off. And I was saying that, you know, I didn't actually say this, but I don't think that I cannot imagine that these two were, that Charlene White is the same author in both cases. The styles are so dramatically different. You know, this Charlene White, I hate, is almost like, seems like somebody who barely escaped grade school. And as I said before the show started, you know, there's almost no adjectives in this. I said to Greg that it's like the characters are moving through a completely featureless set because nothing is described. And except for this one weird 3-page segment in the middle, that's like an acid flashback or a fever dream or a David Lynch segment. The book is just this very flat kind of thing. It has like Mask of Evil and this whole series. You've got the tropes of the, oh, thank you for raping me and giving me that wonderful experience, right? We've got that trope. And yeah, so I mean, the essential plot of the movie is girl leaves small town, marries a guy, joins the circus life, and then she's got to battle through interpersonal difficulties with the people who don't like her because she's not a circus person, but she eventually wins them over. And the book, you know, let me tell you, if this was the book, the only other striking thing about the book is the ending. Because if this was a movie, what you would see would be, it would be the stereotypical ending where the villain's been defeated, the crisis has been averted, whatever the problem was has been resolved. The boy has gotten the girl and they're standing there watching the sunset, roll credits. But right as the credits are starting to roll, she gets down and starts to blow him.
That's an ending right there.
It's great. So clearly, Jim, what you're saying, I'm trying to, you know, back off of the details a little bit and try to get a higher level view of it. Charlene White, you found 2 Charlene White books, one of them being Mask of Evil. These are 2 different writers entirely.
I can't imagine they're not.
Right. So let's just sort of tease that out. You asked me the question earlier, you know, and you asked Joe and I the question, what do we think? Do we think this could be Ed Wood? There's a whole bunch of stuff here in Mask of Evil that actually makes me think these are the kinds of words and the kind of little moments that Ed engaged in, you know, darting tongues. He likes to have, it's literally like, it's like warfare in people's mouths, right? With darting tongues, right?
Lashing tongues.
Yeah, it just goes on and on. Right.
Yeah, he does like to have, like to have tongue play. And as for S&M elements, there's, as Ed goes on in his books, there's nothing that he won't do really. So paddling would be well within his jurisdiction. So it's not impossible, and especially 66 would be fairly early in his novel writing career. Well, Greg has found some possible pre-Killer and Drag stuff that Ed may have gotten published. But 66 would be fairly early. The really heavy writing years don't come until like 67, 68. So it could possibly be an Ed Wood who hasn't found his voice yet. That could be something.
Yeah.
But for instance, if you read the novel of The Casual Company, it doesn't particularly read like Ed's later fiction. It doesn't have the cadence of Ed's, later work at all. It has an Angora sweater in it, but it's not anything like his later novels. And I wouldn't have on my own maybe identified Casual Company as Ed stuff, but it's as Ed as it gets. I mean, this is one of his foundational works. So Ed contains multitudes. Ed's a complicated guy. So it is not impossible. This is well within his style of writing and his subject matter. It just doesn't, the cadence of the writing doesn't, although 66, some of the books were written in 60, some of his verified books were 66, weren't they by then?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. He was getting that was his most prolific period, I think, as a
period,
paperback
I was thinking of
writer.
67, 68.
Yeah, mostly, but he was ramping up by that point for sure.
So,
Pad library stuff, a lot of pad library stuff, mostly.
I'm just in this position where the last few months I've basically been shotgunning Ed Wood's books because they've been on my shoulder this whole time. They've been calling out to me saying, when are you going to read us? When are you going to read us? And I would say that if you are a Wood fan, it is definitely within your interest to just plunge into the books, just get whatever you can of the books, because you'll understand Ed a lot better. I think once you've read a lot of the movies give you some idea, but movies give you certain ideas, but he explores all of his pet themes much more fully in all the books. And you get obsessions that he doesn't get into the movies anywhere, like Adam and Eve. My God, how much does he have to write about Adam and Eve in every other book? And his particular theory about what the apple in the Adam and Eve story is and what the snake was in the Adam and Eve story. This is
3 times. The snake is mentioned 3 times in Mask of Evil.
Are there snakes in this?
Yes, 3 times.
So snakes. Now, snakes would be another good point in the Ed Wood category, because
again, I don't take it to be him, but
Ed Wood not only likes literal snakes and metaphorical snakes.
Sure.
He will have both literal and metaphorical snakes. It's surprising. Like, I guess there's snakes in the movies occasionally, like Bride of the Monster has a snake in it. There's snake imagery in God, I should know. Does Orgy of the Dead does Orgy of the Dead have snakes in it?
It should. If it doesn't,
I don't remember.
I seem to remember like a line like "Permit her to live in the world of the snakes," or something. I've God, if there's one of the dancers who was a snake.
I grew up in and I still live in this general geography, probably about 2 hours south of Poughkeepsie. So this geography of the world, there are a lot of snakes around here. And where he grew up, he would have seen snakes a lot when he was a kid growing up, especially when he would have, traveled west of the Hudson and gone back to Marbletown, where his paternal family was, where he rode horses and they were farmers, and he hung out there on the weekend, every weekend with his family. He would have seen snakes all the time. I'm sure rattlesnakes among many other snakes.
Well, yeah. So, snakes are a key metaphor for Ed, but sometimes they're not metaphorical. Sometimes they're literal. And he loves to have couples making love in nature, and then a snake comes along. That's one of his favorite things to have happen. So snakes would be another good thing to have in an Ed Wood book. I would have to say this. I don't know what the quality control was at Pad Library or at Golden Stripe Arrows. I don't think that the quality control for any of Ed's known publishers was ever as bad as the quality control was on Mask of Evil. I don't think.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
I don't think it ever existed, Joe. I don't think it
But I
ever
mean,
really
there are
existed anywhere.
there are
right?
bloopers. There are bloopers in Ed's books for sure. There are typographical errors
Mhm.
and misspellings in Ed's books, but I've never seen it to the extent that it is in Mask of Evil.
Well,
In
no,
fact,
and even among the First Nighter and After Hours that I've read, Mask of Evil really stands out for the ineptness of the typesetting. One thing I did want to mention before I forget, so, talking about your eyes wide shut moment, again, this scene that drops like a meteorite out of nowhere into the novel, where Elmer the clown. So there's a scene, Joe, that you missed me talking about, where Elmer the clown takes the protagonist Olga into the village, and for some unspecified reason, and he takes her to this rundown looking house that he clearly knows of. This isn't, and they go into the house, and it becomes this almost like dream sequence of these rooms filled with, I just had to double check for myself. It's boys described as minors wearing swimsuits and grotesque masks. And it's clear, I mean, it's stressed that they are underage. And and when they first come into one of the rooms, all the boys is almost as if they're automatons, because they're just standing there motionless and not doing anything. And then at a certain point, sort of on Elmer's command, they come to life and start doing things and interacting. Ultimately, Elmer selects one of the boys, and the walls are mirrored, so it looks like there's millions of underage boys in the room, and dozens of Elmers and Olgas, and eventually Elmer selects one of the young boys, and they pass through one of the mirrored sections of wall where they end up in this other room that's sort of almost like a liminal space. And now suddenly, once they're in that room, the boy is being referred to as a man for some reason, whatever. But they start to do a little bit of a ritualistic chasing each other that finally ends up with Elmer on top of the boy. While that's proceeding, the boys back in the room with Olga suddenly realize she's a girl and start to mock her for being female, and rip all of her clothing off and start slapping at her breasts and mocking her. But then once the action between Elmer the clown and the young boy in the other room that they can see progresses, their attention goes clearly onto that. And and ultimately a maid appears who hands Olga some replacement clothing, and then she's suddenly back at the circus, but she has no idea how she got there. Wow. So that's what that scene encapsulated, is in the middle of this, like, just, pedestrian relationship drama about Olga fighting it out with people at the circus that don't like her.
It's not so funny, right? It really isn't. It is not so funny, right? That's really strange, right?
And then, like I said, about 2/3 of the way through the novel, or 3/4 of the way through, Elmer goes missing, and then it turns out that he was murdered in a village. So presumably he went to another one of these weird Lynchian underage sex parties or something, and somehow ended up dead. That's never we don't really find out how or why that. We just find out he's dead.
Olga, incidentally, Jim, Olga, a number of Arrows Gold Stripe paperbacks circa 73 through 75 or so are attributed to an Olga or a character as Olga, and there are a bunch of Paul Little paperbacks, obviously, incidentally. So again, what you're telling me, not so funny, is not Paul Little, but this is how, guys, so we've been talking about this for a couple of hours now, and obviously the three of us think about this perhaps too much. It's fucking confusing. It's really fucking confusing. We agree, the three of us, Mask of Evil is not written by Ed Wood. We don't know to any extent beyond that. We're not making any claims beyond that. This is strictly what we're going to claim today, because it's so intricate and there are so many different writers, and there are so many, obviously so many different themes, and then there's these themes sort of maturing over time, becoming more graphic with different at
Maturing,
different
that's a word.
Maturing, yeah, perhaps, right? Maybe I'm trying to put a good spin on it, Joe, right?
Well, you were bringing up that, gosh, there's one aspect of this book that of Mask of Evil that I think would make people very uncomfortable. There's a character in it called the Child Woman, and I had to wonder, like, what she's only ever referred to as the Child Woman, and I believe Brigitte has some kind of encounter with her. She just meets this character called the Child Woman, and I was thinking, like, what do they mean by that? Do they mean she's a woman who has sort of a childish demeanor, or is this an actual child who is, so we're getting that part of the novel gets into some very, very dicey territory.
I mean, that made me think of that, like the teen that's on the cusp of womanhood.
Yeah,
that as a adult man, you should not be paying any attention to.
Well, right, so that is a subject that people are, unfortunately, I mean, that's a topic that Ed goes back to. There is a chapter in a book that Ed is credited with called The Oralists. There is a chapter in that book. Holy Mother of God. All I can say about the chapter is that it's one of Ed's, fake sex textbooks, and it's credited to like a Masters and Johnson type couple called Spencer and West.
Right.
And there's a chapter that just says, well, this person was advised to seek therapy, and she is attending therapy. And I was like, I hope she's attending therapy. But there is a chapter in that that is as I didn't think I could be. I thought I was pretty jaded at this point, but there's stuff that in Ed's later books that I thought was pretty shocking. So
I mean, this series was really sort of the start of introducing strongly a lot of transgressive elements into the porn as it existed, and as you go up, through the mid 70s. You can find plenty of stuff from the early to mid 70s that would not be printed today.
Right.
Yeah.
You could go to the first year of National Lampoon magazine, and you will find things in there.
Oh God, yes.
That would never see the light of day in a nationally that wasn't right. That was a humor magazine.
I think we talked about that. I think we talked about that off camera. The last time we had a podcast about the early days of the Lampoon. Some of that stuff is archived online, and you can still find it. But and as I've found out, that was written from a place of real debauchery,
right,
on the behalf of some of the Lampoon writers and editors. So the early days of the Lampoon have some really dicey material and stuff that would definitely not be published today.
Yeah, they were part of that window right after the Supreme Court made its rulings about pornography, where people unleashed all sorts of stuff to find out and it was, it's like finding out where are there boundaries. And you had whole series of, you look into in the 70s and into the early 80s, some of the publishers had entire series of sex with animal books, and sex and all the series that involved your niece and everything else under the sun, and that really only then got that really only got throttled back. I think actually the novels died out really before any of that was throttled back. That was
Paul Little actually developed over time into some really horrifically transgressive stuff from
Yeah.
what I'm seeing right now. He ended up imprints that were sort of holdovers from Greenleaf, of course, was really
Right.
big back in the 60s and early 70s. But by the late 70s and early 80s, Greenleaf was still publishing under a variety of different imprints. And little Paul Hugo Litwinski was still writing for them. And you're right, Jim. They, at this point, hardcore sex is it's in your VCR, it's on your television, right? So we have to try to trump them, and we're
Right.
going to trump them by going way the hell out there. And so Litwinski was writing by that point for Greenleaf in the late 70s and early 80s, all kinds of really crazy shit with animals, and I won't even get into the detail. You can imagine.
Yeah, you know,
yeah.
Ultimately this is going up on my blog, so there's stuff I don't even want to discuss. So
Right.
you know,
right. It's
Well, for most of this, one word suffices, right? Animals,
yes,
Nazis, slavery. I mean, this is when all of this stuff just sort of it's I'll bring us back to The Shining. It's like the elevator door opening up in the early 70s,
blood.
and all this stuff cascading
you know,
out across the sleaze novel landscape.
you know, you bring up the Nazi stuff. Ed goes back to the Nazi image. Gets into the Nazi stuff because people have turned that into a fetish, you know, and people have sort of, you know, that's for some people a kink, I guess. And it produces some of his uglier text. So, you know, some people don't want to know that stuff is out there. They don't even want to acknowledge that it exists. But there's some really ugly stuff in it. In Ed's books, if you go looking for it, there's some really. I was surprised. Like, there was a recent campaign of some self-published Ed Wood reprints that are now on Amazon.
Yeah.
I was surprised that well, I was surprised that The Oralist was one of the books that was chosen for that. That might have been one that I might have buried in a landfill somewhere, and then or in an unmarked grave, and then never published again. But I was surprised that that was one of the ones that actually did get published as part of that. I'm not supporting that campaign. I'm not that because those books are definitely not authorized, and I don't think they have any rights to republish that material, especially, as Greg says, for very inflated prices.
Yeah, I mean, and they're just out to make a buck, so they're not looking at it like, well, this, I'm not gonna resurrect certain Ed books because of the content. They're just looking at it like,
Ed Wood.
if I can slap Ed's name on it, I can make $1, you know?
Yep.
Well, I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I hope over time, and I have a good relationship, as you gentlemen do, with Bob Blackburn, the co-heir of the Kathy Wood estate, and I'm hopeful that over time, and we can debate this until the fucking cows come home, debate, who has the rights to Ed's work, and you could say he's work for hire, so they paid him for it already, and so he has anybody who has any copyright claim to Ed has no copyright claim to any subsequent works that Ed's name may have appeared on, and blah 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 blah. You know what? I want to get Ed's work out there. I want to get it out there. I
do too.
That's it. Bottom line. And if that takes bringing together a coalition of people who have a reasonable claim or interest in Ed. I don't, by the way. I don't fucking know Ed Wood. I never met him, right? Bob Blackburn has clearly, to me, again, not trying to, kiss up to Bob Blackburn. Bob and I are buddies, and he'll find this funny when I say it, but he has a claim more so than I do to publishing any works that are credited to Ed Wood.
I'm just saying, if when that campaign eventually happens, do The Oralist last. Just start with the carnival books. Start with those. Like
Right.
he wrote 3 of the I was writing about those, the 3 carnival novels, Merry-Go-Round, Carnival Peace, and Sideshow Siren. Put those out. Those are like fun ones. Those are crazy. There's like a sideshow, there's murders, and
I think merry-go-round is
Joe, Joe,
where he gets really graphic. Sorry, go ahead.
you need to go out and see the Woodpile Press edition, the photographic cover of the Oral Wood. It'll send you running for the showers. It's so, it's this terrible red mouth licking its lips. It's just.
Oh, wait. That's not the one I'm thinking of, Jim. There was and that's Gavin O'Keefe, the cover artist at Ramble House, and Fender Tucker's the publisher. But Gavin, I've had a couple exchanges with Gavin over the years, and Gavin did a cover for one of the books. I don't think it was that one, but it was so crazy, like sexually, it was so crazy. It was like, wow. I actually remember years ago emailing him and saying, can I get a copy of that image of that cover, and you could sign it for me? And it never came to fruition, but I was like, it's so really transgressive.
I mean, in a just world, there would be such interest in Ed Wood that his novels would be reissued with like a lengthy introduction discussing the themes that you're about to encounter. But when we could certainly do that, but of course we'll be doing that.
It's going to happen, Jim.
We'll be doing that to the sound of change raining out of our pockets, because no money is made in the Ed Wood book world.
No, there's no money to be made here.
Right.
And that's it. Would be interesting to know how many. Okay, great. So somebody's put pirated editions up on Amazon. I wonder how many have even sold.
Oh God, I can't even. Nothing. Right, a handful. Right. If they made a couple $100,
the only thing that has value are originals.
Right.
Well, I don't. You see, I've said before, I don't collect the vintage books because I don't really care about these books as physical objects. I don't really care about them as artifacts from the past. I would just want the text, which is what I have. So I'm more interested in the information in them. So, well,
speaking of that, so do you guys want me to image this and send it along, or?
You're damn right. Not so funny.
You can.
Sure. If you want to spend that much time and effort doing it. I think that Elmer the Clown, that sounds like it's right up my alley, Jim.
I hope you don't mind the format I was doing, and that's the only safe way I have to image the pages clearly without possibly trashing the book.
Yeah.
So,
well, we'll figure it out. And then there's other options, right? We've gotten some books digitized from a source previously that we may be able to tap into again, who does a really good job imaging things digitally without breaking the spine and destroying the book.
Yeah,
right? So we might pursue that. But Elmer the Clown, I definitely want to see Not So Funny. Okay. And I think I found a digital copy of another First Nighter that I think, did I tell you, Jim, it was credited to Byron Kozlov, right? I think I'll grab that, and then we'll dig a little deeper. We'll just continue to dig and dig and dig. And I guess to sort of take a step back right now and say, we're clearly the three of us. I don't think I need to put words in your mouth, but this is not, Mask of Evil is not written by Ed Wood. None of us are saying that. Not at all. Not even remotely. Right.
Sorry.
Right.
Interesting, but not Ed.
Right. It's fun. I talked earlier, I said it got a little boring for me in the latter part, where it seemed like it was just like real short chapters that were just one little sex scene after the other. Like it was almost like having introduced Randy Ransom halfway through the book. The narrative is already kind of exhausted, and the writer has to fill another 60 pages or so. And then it kind of got just perfunctory for me to an extent. Do I think it's a fun book? Yeah, it's a real fun book. All these adult paperbacks are fun books, which is why I would suggest all of you guys go back to 30sg.com, 30th Street Graphics. You can find all kinds of magazines there. You can go back, our previous sponsor, and I'll mention them again, XXX books, over 18,000 scans. And that's where, again, I found another First Snyder book, which I think I'm going to grab. And there's a glut of material out there for sure still today that we can avail ourselves of if we're really trying to dig a little deeper into what Ed Wood may or may not have written, which of course is the nominal sort of enterprise to a ridiculous degree. I think all of you will probably agree that you guys are spend a lot of time on this, and you guys spend a lot of energy on this, and we do because we genuinely want to try to discover things. Go ahead, Joe.
No, it's just because it's fun. I find a satisfaction. I just find digging through these old books, I just get a weird kind of satisfaction from it. And I just like the way these, I don't know, it's just a weird window into the past. So, but when the ones that are actually attributed to Ed Wood has the extra thing of that it's an insight into one person's mind and how one guy's mind actually worked, and how he got his obsessions into print over and over and over again. And so I didn't get that from Mask of Evil. So that was the only thing that Mask of Evil doesn't provide for this kind of book, is it doesn't provide insight into the mind of Ed Wood. It doesn't seem to provide insight into the mind of Charlene White, for that matter. It's
whomever she is, right?
Whoever he or she may be.
Right.
So
last words, Jim, what do you think?
I think I've about said everything for tonight.
All right.
I've said all the words that I know how to say. I don't know any other
The
words.
only other thing I'm going to say is there are a whole bunch of keywords in this book that actually seem to line up with words that Ed would use with relative frequency. Pink orbs, pink tipped breasts. I could go on and on and on. But again, you're going to get misled if you get hung up on a word. Angora is a good word, but Angora is not even 100% a signature. I thought that maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and then I realized that Paul Little likes the word Angora. A writer named John Cleave likes the word Angora. A pseudonymous author named Victoria Parker, who may or may not be Paul Little, I'm not sure yet. She loves the word Angora and uses it in dozens of books. So we have a long way to go.
I mean, so far what I would say is diagnostic.
Right.
Would be the lack of the word Angora. There isn't a definitively known Ed Wood novel from that period of 63 to 75 that does not have the word Angora in it.
Right.
So if somebody were to propose one that from that period that didn't have Angora in it, I'm not saying I wouldn't be open to that, but it would then be a question of okay, so we're now looking at his only novel we know of that doesn't have Angora running around in it. Why would that be? Anyway.
So
if Ed were writing this, he would have put Angora in it.
That's great. Let's close it there, guys. I agree wholeheartedly. No Angora in Mask of Evil. Mask of Evil, not likely an Ed Wood book. But we'll be back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I appreciate you guys enormously. This has been so much fun. I can't believe we talked about Louis Buñuel. We talked about fucking The Great Gatsby and fucking F. Scott Fitzgerald. We're drawing associations that I think are pretty astonishing. So this has been a tremendous amount of fun for me. We're going to be back here. I'm sure I'll be back here with Jim and Joe, separate,
talking about something
together. We'll be back, and we're going to talk more about Ed Wood here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. I hope you found this fun and beneficial as always.
Take care.